Grand Rising family. This is your girl, Empress Goddess, the Georgia Peach. I hope you're well. I hope your family's well. Ashe. As for me, I'm doing lovely. Another day. We're going to get into decoding the Last Supper. Decoding the Last Supper. Let's find out what was hidden in Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting, The Last Supper.
I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex. The Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most famous pieces of art. It's a fresco located in Milan, Italy, and has been the object of analysis by cryptographers for many, many centuries. As one of the most famous works of art in the world, and because it's attached to a wall, this painting cannot be sold. In fact, it's priceless. This painting seems to house so many encryptions in it that in fact it's become the subject of mainstream media and films for many years. Dan Brown's account in the Da Vinci Code is one example of this. Holy Blood, Holy Grail also points us in a similar direction, hidden encryptions inside the Last Supper painting. The first of these that everyone iconically remembers is that what we all believed was John the Apostle sitting to the right of Jesus was not in fact John the Apostle at all. In his very hermaphroditic sort of garb and look, John is actually the representation, many believe, to be Mary Magdalene. One of the things that we notice is that there is a void space between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, Jesus has clearly a symbol of what looks to be an upside down triangle represented as the divine feminine. What I realized is that the inverted triangle of the Last Supper also carries the exact same angular reference of 51.843 degrees. Is this yet again pointing us to the Giza Plateau? What we find here also is other encryptions deeply hidden within this enigmatic painting. Another example that we can see here is that the face of Peter the Apostle, who strangely has his hand down the blouse of Mary Magdalene, and his right hand seems to be holding in a contorted position a knife. And who is it that's sitting in between Peter and Mary Magdalene? That's none other than Judas himself. In fact, you can see him holding his 30 pieces of silver in a small bag. Why would it appear as though Peter is seeming to conspire in some way, shape, or form with Mary Magdalene? And why is it that she's leaning in to listen to his whisper? What would they have to whisper about? And the face, there's something with the face of Peter also that seems to be drawing attention. Weren't all the apostles roughly the same age as Jesus? When Jesus was crucified, he was widely known to have been 33 years old. And yet we see the face of Peter as being a man probably in his late 40s or early 50s, having almost all gray, even white hair. But is there something else that we can notice about his face? Well, if we look at a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci from a similar period but later in his life, we'll notice that the face of Leonardo da Vinci himself in his own self-portrait matches the face of Peter, the apostle, who later became the head of the entire church. And is the knife that's being held behind his back a knife held by his hand? Or rather, is he holding the wrist of Mary Magdalene? These questions and more were the subject of our analysis. We also looked at the back wall noticing that there were many other encryptions that somehow relate to other prominent places in none other than the
Big
King's Chamber
Chief.
itself.
Prior to visiting the Great Pyramid of Giza in 2018, Robert Grant intuitively sketched 2 particular Greek letters in his notebook, as if subconsciously making connections between the King's Chamber and the Last Supper that were yet to be discovered.
When I arrived in Egypt, I looked down while in the King's Chamber. I noticed the presence of what looked to be 2 letters, the Alpha and the Omega. So an Alpha and Omega on the sarcophagus of the King's Chamber. Isn't the pyramid famously devoid of any writing or hieroglyphics? And for thousands of years, hasn't this room been frequented by millions of people potentially? Let's not forget, this is the most studied building on the planet. It was the tallest building in the world for well over 4,000 years. And the King's Chamber is the most prominent of the chambers within the Great Pyramid. How is it even possible that this could not have been seen before? And is there anything that relates to the Last Supper that might point us in the same direction? You'll note that underneath the table, you can see the feet of several of the apostles. Some of them are wearing sandals. And you'll notice as well that if you try to look for the feet of Jesus, you will not be able to see the feet of Jesus because they're obstructed by what looks to be the upper doorway of some sort of portal in and out of the chapel where the Last Supper painting is housed. But what's also interesting about this is that when we notice the location of that portal, and if we believe art historians, they say that later in the 17th century, a doorway was cut into the wall of this very famous painting. Now, this doesn't really seem to hold water for me because Leonardo da Vinci was famous in his lifetime. In fact, this was a very famous fresco that the King of France himself made particular mention of in historical records. So why would the owners or the people that were taken care of as caretakers of this important place on hallowed ground have cut a doorway obstructing the painting of Leonardo da Vinci, potentially even then known as one of the greatest artists of all time?
If in fact the doorway was not cut into the fresco years later, but had always been there, as Robert Grant suggests, then the question arises, did Leonardo da Vinci integrate this door into his masterpiece? And if so, what is the significance of this possible encryption?
So when I started to notice that the other proportions of the room of the King's Chamber were relative to the Last Supper painting and vice versa, I started to think, are there other encryptions that might be hidden inside the walls of the Last Supper painting that are showing us and pointing us back to the King's Chamber itself?
What Robert Grant realized is that the placement of the Alpha and the Omega on the rim of the sarcophagus within the King's Chamber are proportionate to Jesus, the Alpha, and Mary Magdalene, the Omega, within the Last Supper.
And when we place an overlay, the exact position of the sarcophagus in its original position would occupy exactly the doorway that is obstructing the feet of both Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And we'll also notice that the proportions, when we place precisely the line of the ceiling against the back wall, which would reference what we refer to as the western wall of the Great Pyramid, is precisely pointing to the same proportional dimensions so that the entire table in perspective could be viewed as being part of the Last Supper scene. Is this telling us something more about the windows and portals and tapestries that are located within the Last Supper painting itself? Of course, we also notice that the location in the Last Supper painting of both Jesus and Mary Magdalene also conforms precisely to the golden number and golden cut. 1.618 versus one. Interesting as well that again, these proportions are matched in the Alpha Omega that I discovered on the rim of the sarcophagus, which is exactly 5.6 inches wide. The King's Chamber is 31.415926 meters. And the square root of that number, which is pi times 10, turns out to be 5.605 inches. 5.605 squared equals the dimension of the perimeter of the King's Chamber room itself. Interestingly as well, the serif, or the peak of the letter A, is precisely at the 33rd inch of the 89.62 inch long sarcophagus. I and my colleagues note that is exactly 1 over the Euler number.
Euler's number is best known as the base for natural logarithms and is used in everything from explaining exponential growth, radioactive decay, and calculating compound interest.
This is a very important number, as fundamental as transcendental pi. In fact, if we take both of those numbers and we apply them together in the relationship of a tetrahedron nested within a sphere, we find that when we consider that a tetrahedron nested within a sphere would have a displacement of 1/3 of the volume of the sphere inside the tetrahedron, and 2/3 being outside of the tetrahedron nested within that sphere. And we apply those same proportions in a weighted average calculation. What we find is that pi times 2/3 plus Euler number, which is 2.718, times 1/3, added together in a weighted average calculation, gives us integer value 3.000. Both of these numbers seem to be boundary conditions for integer value 3. But why would we have the Euler number pointed to the alpha and omega on the...
What the heck happened here?
an omega on the rim of the sarcophagus? Advanced knowledge? Additionally, in the Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci left an area value of the square that didn't match the area value of the circle, which is pi.
Trying to let y'all see some of these graphics.
Radius of 1. Instead, he left us an encrypted message for all to see, which is that the area, if we take the time to actually measure it, using the radius value of 1 of the circle, turns out to be precisely the Euler number. 200 years prior to this purported discovery of the Euler number and its attributes, arguably the second most important mathematical constant to mathematicians, even of our day today. What was Leonardo trying to tell us? What else can we see inside the Last Supper painting? Let's look a little bit closer at the window behind Jesus. If we look closely at the pediment above Jesus, immediately above him and above the window behind him, we'll notice an eye. Not only is this orientation showing us and pointing to an eye, but we're also seeing that this is an ancient symbol used in Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism as an all-seeing eye. But
Wow.
in Egyptian mythology and history, we know better. This eye is the eye of Ra, god of the sun. So quite fitting, in fact, that it's above the sun of God. But in esotericism, this goes deeper to explain the separation between the conscious mind, which is acting for us like a sun to the outside world, and the subconscious mind is the missing eye. But it's the eye that's always there, but not shown in this outward world. This eye is referred to the eye of Horus. Now, going back into Egyptian mythology and the story of Osiris. Osiris had quite a conflict and battle with Set. And Set was able to defeat Osiris, and in fact, he cut him into 14 parts. And as he cut him into 14 parts, of course, his son, Horus, wanting to avenge the death of his father, Horus took on a battle with Set. And in that battle, Horus lost his left eye. It was plucked out, as the mythology tells us in the Egyptian pantheon. This plucking out of the left eye of Horus could be pointing to something more significant. And in esoteric circles, it actually represents the loss of our intuitive sight. The loss of the feminine, which this eye, which is often referenced as the eye of Thoth, because it was restored eventually by Thoth. Horus had lost his left eye, went to Thoth and asked Thoth to repair it for him. And Thoth used magic to repair the eye. So often, this eye is referred to as the eye of Thoth. The two eyes of Horus, the right eye being the eye of Ra, and the left eye being the eye of Thoth. Represented by the moon, intuition, the feminine, that which might be, in a mathematical sense, irrational, and merging it together with the linear lines of the rational. The conscious mind taking over the personification of our own persona and ego. And the unconscious or subconscious mind being represented by this eye that was missing and plucked out. So where is this eye of Horus? Maybe we need to turn to yet another Da Vinci painting to see where this might connect us back to this eye of Horus that's the left eye and often referred to as the eye of Thoth.
The clues to locate the eye of Thoth may be found in another Da Vinci masterpiece, possibly inspired by a famous woman of royalty who once lived with Leonardo da Vinci, the controversial wife of King Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn.
Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was known as one of the most enchanting women of the day. From 1516 until 1519, Leonardo da Vinci lived in the same home as Anne Boleyn. What had happened was King Francis of France had conquered Milan and the Sforza family. And when he went to Milan, he immediately asked to go into the chapel, and they did not want it to be destroyed. He wanted to see this very famous fresco by Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was, of course, still alive. In his aging years, he was asked by King Francis to move into his palace to spend the rest of his days helping to design an ambitious new castle. So he recruited him to do so, and Leonardo moved everything in his life at that time out of Vinci to Chateau d'Amboise, which was the seat at the time of the French court. Anne Boleyn happened to eventually enchant King Henry VIII so much that he left his first wife in a period of time that this was expressly forbidden unless granted an annulment from the Pope of Rome himself, which the Pope refused to grant to the King of England, Henry VIII. So Henry VIII was able to finally divorce her by establishing his own new church, the Church of England, which is today the Episcopal Church. Anne Boleyn later became the mother of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I, who was one of the greatest and longest reigning monarchs of Great Britain since that time, only eclipsed today by Elizabeth II. Anne Boleyn was also famously tried for having had an adulterous affair with another man while she was married to the king. The king used that as the impetus to cut off her head, famously. But Anne Boleyn lived in the same house in her late teenage years as Leonardo da Vinci. And today, we believe that there's a painting that represents their meeting. And that painting is referred to today as La Belle Ferronnière, the ironmaker's daughter. Now, as we look at this painting, we'll notice some prominent things about it. First of all, it has a very dark background, almost like the night sky. And as we look at it, we'll also notice that her part seems to be very significant. It represents an inverted T or Tau cross, another symbol of Rosicrucian encryption. Additionally, we also notice that she has what looks to be some sort of amber gem right over her forehead, right between her eyes, not far from where we would expect to see like a bindu in an Indian person who is representing their Ajna chakra, their third eye. We also notice that the light that is caressing the strands of her hair adjacent to her part line actually looks very similar to an iris. Can we also see that the hair and the light bouncing off of the strands of her hair adjacent to her part line are actually forming the lines of the iris of this eye that is surrounding her head in the darkness. Because of the orientation of the eye, we notice that, of course, it is a left eye. And if we place this painting immediately adjacent to the Last Supper scene, is this the missing eye of Horus that we find on this female archetype in Anne Boleyn, a famous character in history who happened to live in the same home as Leonardo da Vinci for 3 years prior to his death? Is Leonardo pointing us yet again to this merger of heart-brain consciousness? We'll also notice on the back wall, there appear to be many hidden encryptions. You can see a lantern. You can also see script writing, and you can also see what looks to be the profile of a lion. On the left side, we'll also notice a letter A prominently above the tapestries that is on the left wall as we look at it. But can we find other things as well that are hidden into this painting that might actually point us, like a map, to other things inside of the King's Chamber itself? Let's first look to see if we can find the Eye of Ra on the back wall of the King's Chamber, behind the sarcophagus on the western wall. Of Horus that we find on this female archetype in Anne Boleyn, a famous character in history who happened to live in the same home as Leonardo da Vinci for 3 years prior to his death. Is Leonardo pointing us yet again to this merger of heart-brain consciousness? We'll also notice on the back wall, there appear to be many hidden encryptions. You can see a lantern. You can also see script writing, and you can also see what looks to be the profile of a lion. On the left side, we'll also notice a letter A prominently above the tapestries that is on the left wall as we look at it. But can we find other things as well that are hidden into this painting that might actually point us, like a map, to other things inside of the King's Chamber itself? Let's first look to see if we can find the Eye of Ra on the back wall of the King's Chamber, behind the sarcophagus on the western wall. In the exact same location, when we mirror match the precise location of the seam between the ceiling and the back wall, crossing over two stones, and you can see the line of the entire eye, and also what looks to be almost like a yin-yang iris inside that eye on the same location of the back wall. The King's Chamber, famously devoid of any markings or writings, now has yielded up to us an alpha omega on the rim. We also found a compass not far from the alpha omega, pointing out degree references. And now we're seeing that the back wall of the King's Chamber is matching up with what is painted more than 500 years ago into the fresco in Milan by Leonardo himself. What other things can we find in this painting? On the right wall, we can see the faint letters of Alpha A written in a script from the period, Renaissance period script, Alpha Q W. W is a lowercase omega. Alpha Chi Omega. The Last Supper painting, just like the Vitruvian Man painting, houses within it hidden inscriptions that Leonardo da Vinci more than 500 years ago left to us to find through time, representing this very ancient symbology of balancing the square and the circle, finding the balance between the masculine and the feminine, and bringing together polarity into unity consciousness, merging the rational mind with the unconscious creativity that is resident within achievement of the heart, brain, mind, and consciousness. Could Leonardo da Vinci be pointing us to a deeper, hidden, esoteric wisdom teaching? Join us for our next episode, where we're going to go deeper into this great mystery to understand what it means for us. I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex. I've had the opportunity over my lifetime to live in 9 different countries and visit over 140 different countries. I feel very blessed and lucky to have been able to see the world like that. In fact, I thought the best way to learn the cultures of those countries was to actually learn the languages. So I've learned 8 languages in my lifetime, and I speak 5 of them fluently today. Because of that view of looking at the world through the lens of language, I looked very differently at all the patterns in life that I would come across. This is true also for mathematics. And I started looking very differently at patterns in general. I would always see things that some of my colleagues that I worked with would never see in quite the same way. And I thought that was just sort of like a weird quinky-dink and how I saw the world a little bit differently. But when I went to Egypt and started traveling to all the ancient sites, I couldn't help but notice the numerous patterns that were left behind by the architects and builders in living stone. In 2019, I took a group of about 50 people to Egypt with me on a discovery mission. I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex. What is philosophy? Well, if we break it down, it's actually 2 words: philo, or philo, and Sophia. Philo just simply means lover, and Sophia means wisdom. Philosophia is lover of wisdom. But philosophy was never intended to be something that was simply the study of rhetoric or of what other philosophers said and thought. Maybe that was an element of it. But in the ancient sense, philosophy was irrevocably tied to the concept of polymathy. A polymath, also in the ancient sense, poly simply means many, and math meant learning. Philosophy was not specifically an area of study. It was something that came as a result of studying many different things. And those things would be a mix of what is today referred to as the quadrivium. The quadrivium is referring to music, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic. Today, we teach children that math is entirely separate from music, when actually it's not. We also teach our young people that art has nothing to do with science, when actually that is false. The way we're teaching our children in the world today is separating them out from their own things that they would like to pursue in their lives. I was a musician who had to give up music when I decided to become a responsible contributor to society. But if I could still be able to practice music and also recognize that it is the foundational form of geometry that informs all science and all matter and all energy in the entire universe, isn't that something that's important to know? We often think of our brain some sort of hard drive for information. But what if we looked at this differently? What if we recognize that the brain is really just a radio receiver? And that in order for us to tune the receiver, our emotional state has a huge impact on that. In this analogy, we could say that the brain is a radio and the heart is the tuning dial. If we take this analogy even further, then maybe some certain things we need to do to be able to optimize our radio receivers and their tuning would actually benefit us. If we were a runner and we only exercise one half of our body, that would really cause a problem for having the balance Newton believed that he was finding the signature of the like solids. But what if we looked at this differently? What if we recognize that the brain is really just a radio receiver? And that in order for us to tune the receiver, our emotional state has a huge impact on that. In this analogy, we could say that the brain is a radio and the heart is the tuning dial. If we take this analogy even further, then maybe some certain things we need to do to be able to optimize our radio receivers and their tuning would actually benefit us. If we were a runner and we only exercise one half of our body, that would really cause a problem for having the balance required to be a very successful runner. The mental athlete and philosopher knows that they must have a balance of understanding to tune their minds and their brains to their optimal performance to receive universal consciousness. If we look through time, we'll notice that the people that seem to discover the most mathematics and physics throughout history, from Pythagoras and Plato to Socrates, in concepts not only relational to geometric forms like the Platonic solids, or musical ratios and intervals like Pythagoras discovered, but all the way up into including discrete mathematics as well as physics. Isaac Newton discovered gravity, but Isaac Newton was also a musician. A lot of people don't know that he was a deep alchemist. In fact, 80% of his works were all centered around concepts of alchemy and astrology. Isaac Newton believed that he was finding the signature of the Creator. He was a deeply spiritual man. And he realized that everything was connected, just like Johannes Kepler, who gave us the Kepler's laws of motion. He also was looking for this architect of the universe, understanding as well the musical concepts in what he termed the harmony of the spheres. If we go to René Descartes, the famous philosopher who references "I think, therefore I am," also a mathematician. He's the person who gave us the Cartesian plane in mathematics. As we go through history, we start to realize that even mathematicians like Leonard Euler was an innovator not only in math, but across music, as was Bernard Riemann of the famed Riemann hypothesis, still an open problem in mathematics, yet to be fully proven. He's also famous for Neo-Riemannian music theory. It's interesting, isn't it? Because today we've broken up all of these different disciplines into their individual categories, and never the twain shall meet, thus turning off our ability to receive from the universe. Ramanujan was a famous mathematician who was deeply spiritual also. He was never trained directly in mathematics. Yet Cambridge University, the same university from which we had Isaac Newton, declared Ramanujan one of the top mathematicians of all time. Yet Ramanujan claims that his discoveries mathematically were received from a great universal source. I fundamentally believe that as well. As one who has tapped into this higher consciousness from time to time, what I experience is actually that they all come out as equally balanced across science and art. When I'm drawing geometry, I'm not trying to draw an artistic form. Most of the time in my efforts, I'm actually trying to discover and understand a principle of the universe. And while I'm trying to depict it in a way that my mind can synthesize, it comes out in an artistic way. I believe that the future of humanity is to go deeply into this next stage of our evolution, to realize that our brains are not actually simply hard drives and storage units of information, but rather radio receivers with which to receive and understand the universal language of consciousness. I've said before, I don't really consider myself much of a mathematician because I don't want to be pigeonholed into my way of thinking. The old adage applies: if you're a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. What I noticed is that for me to get deeper into understanding of mathematics, often it is through the doorway and portal of music or art or philosophy that I'm able to tap into a higher understanding of the underlying math and language behind the concepts I'm trying to understand further. We've all seen the very famous Sistine Chapel in the fresco in the ceiling. And I remember going there for the very first time and just being awestruck at the beauty of Michelangelo's artwork on that Sistine Chapel ceiling. We've all seen also Adam outreaching to God in this representation. But I remember the first time I went there, I started to ask myself the question, What is it that's around God in the painting? Could it possibly be the cross-section of a human brain? And as you get deeper into that analysis, you'll notice that the cerebellum is prominently displayed on the right side. You can also see all of the different aspects of the prefrontal cortex, the temporal lobe, all of it being displayed simply in this artistic form that he left on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Even God the Father in this famous iconic image has his leg shaped in a mirrored imagery of Adam's right leg, just as the fingers outreaching to each other are mirror images of the same concept. What's Michelangelo trying to tell us? Is he trying to tell us something about the nature of the universe and the U inverse? Also notice that God the Father's head is in the prefrontal cortex, where the brain has its highest degree of higher order thought and creativity. But what if the only means to tap into this and move beyond this reptilian brain of fight or flight is to balance the muscle? The mental athlete will know that he or she must be balanced above all else. And that balance can only be achieved intellectually by having an understanding of music and its equal mirrored opposite across the corpus callosum, mathematics. Math and music are simply representations of two opposite sides of our brain. But that's also true as well for visual art, which we have near our occipital lobe at the back of the brain. And its mirrored opposite representation, in this context, is the natural sciences. So we can now see the brain as a different kind of receiver that ultimately is intended to ignite and activate the center, right amid the corpus callosum, the connective tissue that allows us to both think and feel simultaneously. As we can balance our brain muscle through our study of the quadrivium, then we can actually activate the pineal and pituitary glands. And when we do so, it forms a Merkaba. That Merkaba allows us to access different fields of awareness that are above and beyond our third and fourth dimensional planes of understanding. The philosophers knew this. And yet, it was something that could be very dangerous during their lifetimes. Because as they got to this point of higher knowledge and ascension, their lives were at risk. And this has been seen over and over and over again throughout history. The good news for us today is we're now living in a different time. The earth is intended now through this aeon, this portion of our precession of equinox, and this age of Aquarius is intended for us to be able to seek, and not only seek, but also experience this level of higher awareness. That what the philosophers experienced and all the myriad discoveries that they had in their renaissances throughout time will now be coming again to this earth. Carl Jung was a very famous psychologist and psychiatrist. Carl had been a protege of Sigmund Freud, but he realized the limitations of Sigmund Freud's philosophical perspective on psychiatry, and he noticed that most of the concepts of Freud were rooted in these very arcane approaches and belief that mankind was literally chained to the lower segments of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But Carl Jung believed a different future for humanity. As a philosophical, wisdom-seeking alchemist, Carl Jung noted that there was a divine future for humanity. He called this process individuation in a book that he wrote called Aeon. This individuation process is something that is achieved through balanced thought and study, resulting in philosophy. What Carl Jung believed is that as we ascend to higher knowledge through learning to balance our brain centers across the quadrivium, that we will be able to experience new higher dimensional experiences, provided, however, that we learn how to integrate our shadows. If we live in a U inverse, every experience you have is your responsibility. My experiences are my responsibility. Fear could be real from the perspective of danger. Danger is real, but fear actually is a choice. How we interact and deal with the deck of cards that we are dealt on a day-to-day basis is what defines our reality, not the deck of cards that we're given. Every moment that we experience can either be the best or the worst. The choice is up to us. How we decide to perceive the world defines our ultimate experience with it. And Carl Jung understood this, and he taught this in the concepts of shadow integration. Whatever we're judging in other people is actually what we do and simply don't want to acknowledge in our conscious minds.
Exactly. Projection.
And as we understand this, we start to see the world around us in a very different way. This is the mirror of consciousness. In order to access higher planes and dimensions, we have to learn to transcend these notions of duality, even down to the very basic concepts of how we perceive light and dark. The word guru comes from two Sanskrit terms, gu and ru, which means light from dark. The light needs the dark as much as the dark
needs the light. I tell y'all that all the time.
Even the very
It's about
separation
balance.
of that light from dark is simply the polarity of our own perception.
Right.
The alchemists knew this concept.
The way people talk
They
to
taught
you
it
is the
in
way
a
they feel about
process
themselves.
called the alchemical path. And you can find it in numerous images, both found in Hermeticism and Rosicrucianism and its many different orders and forms. You can imagine that each of us is like a iceberg. And imagine that your conscious mind is the component of the iceberg that's above the water. It lives in a world that it believes it's separate from altogether. All the while, the iceberg may not even be consciously aware, if it were sentient, that most of the iceberg is actually underwater. It perceives all of it as being separate. But what if that entire world above the surface of the water were actually a projection from the iceberg that is under the surface of the water? This is the philosophy that was taught to us by Carl Jung. Everything spins and all experiences come back to oneness, but it's up to us to perceive it. In alchemy, the way that this process of the alchemical path is represented is through the representation of birds. These different categorizations of the alchemical path are broken into the following categories and stages: nigredo, or blackening; the albedo, or whitening; the rubedo, or the reddening; and the final stage, which is the phoenix. These different stages are represented by a crow for nigredo, a swan for albedo, a pelican representing sacrifice for rubedo.
Of course, y'all know why a crow, Negro is represented by a crow, because you all know Negro mean black, right? And a crow is black. Boy, them motherfuckers hell.
Images are contemplated and well portrayed in numerous pieces of Hermetic art. Often at the center, we will find the divine hermaphrodite, often depicted as wearing both a black cloak on one side and a white cloak on the other. We see also the archetypes of
Hold on a
Apollo.
second. Go to full screen so y'all can see it. And back it up a little bit.
The god of the sun, and Diana, the god of the moon, representing our own way of seeing the masculine and the feminine energies of our universe. They are accompanied often by similar archetypes of the phoenix that is on fire, that is adjacent to Apollo, holding the sun in the palm of his hand, and in fact, next to a rampant and powerful lion, representing courage. Whereas Diana, on the other hand, is holding the moon in her left hand, and accompanied by the deer, and all the representations that accompany that, the Agila, or the thunderbird. All of these are simply different perspectives across polarities of male and feminine perception. And yet, in order for us to merge these worlds together, we must balance our minds and learn to observe rather than to judge. Jesus gave two great commandments. He said, "Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, might, mind, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself."
On these two commandments.
Then he goes on to say, "Judge not, lest ye be judged with the same judgment with which you have judged others."
Right. That's karma.
His message was not one of hate thine enemy, take out an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, as had been taught in the Old Testament. But the New Testament was one that was more about good news. Don't judge, because really you're just judging yourself.
Right.
And secondly, love your neighbor as yourself. The stages of alchemy are intended for us to be able to learn to integrate our shadow side and accept and love those things about ourselves that we have a hard time accepting. In the beginning, you'll start noticing crows in the world around you, like daily, making their squawking sound,
hey, Beverly, how you
causing
doing,
all
love?
kinds of havoc. And it may get to the point where it starts to really bother you. Then you'll know you're clearly in the Negredo stage, or blackening stage, which is where you're intended to confront and learn the aspects of your shadow, those aspects of yourself that
the blackening stage, the crow.
so deeply into your subconscious mind, so as not to identify with them whatsoever. These are the things that you don't like about yourself.
Right. Projection all
Albedo
day.
is a respite, and many confuse the stage of albedo as an enlightenment stage in it itself. You get a bit of a break, and you start realizing that life isn't so bad after all. Much of this activity will be precipitated by some life crisis. And Carl Jung also points this out, along with all the other alchemists through history. As we proceed to the next stage, we start experiencing the opening of our other eye, our third eye, which can see everywhere, represented by the peacock, which has so many eyes on all of its feathers. This is represented by the yellowing. It's kind of a greenish yellow. And imagine the beauty of the peacock opening up. This is the center of this wave of new experience. You'll start experiencing these things on a day-to-day basis. In fact, you'll start to see new experiences and perceptions that you never had noticed before. Then you'll be introduced to the concept of the animus and the anima. The anima and the animus would be the representation of all those things that you haven't liked about yourself and have not been attracted to in yourself, that personify the opposite sex. Carl Jung says that as we meet our anima, that would be their opposite personality type embodied in the form of someone you would not normally think to be attractive. And now you find yourself magnetically drawn to this personage. This is called the rubedo. The rubedo leads us to the alchemical marriage, a necessary step and process of the final integration of the shadow into your consciousness, whereupon you start to see the world in terms of empathy, love, and compassion. The alchemical marriage is such a critical aspect of alchemy that it is something that must be entered into as a very sacred union. Think of it not as a physical union per se, but rather as a union of the two sides of your mind. The left brain, if you're right-handed, representing the rational thought, the seats of mathematics and natural sciences like physics and chemistry, and the right brain being the seat of music, creativity, irrational thought, out-of-the-box thinking, and as well, total creativity. When we learn to merge these two aspects, then we find our lives take on an entirely different meaning and scope, as if by overnight. And then the soul emerges as a newly resurrected, and we call this the stage of the phoenix. This is when the soul takes flight to experience once again the oneness of self.
Are y'all enjoying this? If you are, put a 1 in the chat.
I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex. In our previous episodes, we've seen already how Leonardo da Vinci has encrypted detailed mathematical constants and other information into his various works after the time he spent in Egypt. The Vitruvian Man being principal and the first encryption that I was able to decrypt. Besides Leonardo da Vinci, however, were there other people during the Renaissance who possessed similar knowledge? Because surely it couldn't only be that Leonardo had access to such
all those paintings got
information.
hidden messages in them.
The others that we noted that we have found thus far, and there are probably many that we don't yet know or realize, actually were so concerned that they might be found out that they felt the need to encrypt all of their efforts, not only in the form of encryption that we found already, both mathematical and artistic related, but even under a pen name. Might that pen name have been William Shakespeare? William Shakespeare is quite possibly one of the most famous people and prominent figures in English literature. Today, just the volume of words that he himself innovated and brought to the world is astounding. One could write an entire dictionary out of just the words he introduced to the English language alone. And yet, he even introduced concepts that were prevalent in other languages in the course of his plays, sonnets, and other literary works.
And you know, that was
William Shakespeare today.
He was like one of the, because I was in college preparatory classes, and he was like one of the main writers we had to read books on in school. His plays and everything, Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe. They were like part of the curriculum. Those two, you would believe you was gonna read some Shakespeare and some Poe.
Stands as a paragon of English literature that is still studied and restudied over and over again by students the world over. One of the people that has done one of the most extensive research projects around William Shakespeare is my friend and colleague, Alan Green. Alan is the quintessential cryptographer and cryptologist that has cracked the Shakespeare Code, realizing that William Shakespeare himself is actually a collective of several different Rosicrucian and Renaissance period polymaths who not only wrote the plays of William Shakespeare, but also encrypted the sonnets, 154 of which include deep and profound messages of significance relevant to our day to day. And in addition, they even wrote the King James Version of the Bible.
Wow, ha, ha. Well.
Alan is going to be explaining to us what he has found as he has researched all of the works of William Shakespeare in the simplicity as a starting point of the cover of the sonnets. These were poems written in such beautiful prose, and they mirror iambic pentameter mathematical principles. Yet again, another form of experiencing geometric beauty. Alan Green has decrypted the cover of the sonnets, and we're excited to share it with you today.
This is the original title page of Shakespeare's sonnets, as first published in 1609. It looks fairly normal for the period, except for the two horizontal lines that usually add critical information between them. The fact that they're empty is a clue that's been ignored for 400 years. We're going to look deeper. We're going to literally connect the dots, the punctuation. The TT stands for Thomas Thorpe, the publisher. Look at the italic slope of that second T. It's actually guiding us to connect this dot at 1609 to this dot at imprinted, using the sloping T as a guide. Is there any other dot that's drawing attention to itself? Well, yeah, the G dot is only about 10 times the size it's supposed to be. And so let's connect it to the D dot and to the 1609 dot. And we find we have a perfect right angle triangle. Interesting. Now, just as that second T was a guide, the dot after that second T is a guide. If we look where the 1609 dot is pointing through there and on up, it lands at the right end of the seemingly random top horizontal line, but obviously it's not random.
Hand getting all getting
Into
tired.
that point and connect it to the G and it to the D, and again we have another second right angle triangle. Kind of makes you wonder about the second line here, and yes, same situation. The only dot left is the Aspley dot here, and if we do the same thing here, we find we've got 4 perfect right angle triangles. In fact, that last one is more than an ordinary right angle triangle. It's a perfect 3, 4, 5 triangle. Well, remember Pythagorean theory from high school, 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, yes. So, what is this really? It's actually hiding this. Perfect circle passes through all the 6 points. This is a visual representation of something called Thales' theorem, named after the Greek philosopher who scholars believe was Pythagoras' mentor. But Thales is best known as the first person to measure the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and he did it using the geometry of right angle triangles. Now let's complete the image by connecting the 2 remaining intersections between the circle and the horizontal lines here and here. Now obviously no one works at this level of precision just to hide some triangles. There's got to be more going on here. We must measure them. By G, 2B, E, N, E. During the Renaissance, the letter G was often used on maps and emblems to indicate the globe or the earth. And anciently, the Pythagoreans used the letter G to mean geometry itself, the measuring of the earth. So looking again at these TT dots connected to the G, we have in the easterly direction, E for east, and it's a zero horizontal baseline. Now, if it's really about measuring the Earth, perhaps all these lines that are radiating out from this enormous G dot, drawing attention to itself, are all radiating out from it. Maybe they are intended to be thought of as lines of latitude. We measure
I'm almost getting tired now.
20 degrees exactly.
Y'all get the drift.
And this one below the horizontal baseline is 20 degrees exactly. And we have another baseline here, don't we, that we discovered the tangent to the circle. Oh, wow. If we use that as a baseline, there's another angle here, 20 degrees. They're all perfectly 20 degrees. Makes you wonder about these two, the remaining ones that are on the circumference, the only ones that have not been measured, because they're not perfect. And so we have to measure them by trigonometry. I will spare you the math again.
Oh, I hated that shit. Ugh.
But essentially, we can surmise that because this is obviously oriented to the north of its baseline and
That
this
damn
to the
trigonometry.
east, perhaps they are latitude north, longitude east. NE. Well, the numbers are here and here worked out. Is it true that they are coordinates? Let that sink in. Stunning, exquisite, all done by placement of the punctuation and two lines.
Alan's research is showing us that with the simplicity of two straight lines and 6 dots, one of which was oversized by about 10 times versus the others, the writers of the sonnets encrypted something very profound in a mathematical relationship called Thales' theorem. And in addition, as we'll soon see, almost all the major mathematical constants can be derived from the extrapolation of the Thales theorem. But where is this going? Why would these Rosicrucian Hermetic wisdom seekers be encrypting the cover of the sonnets? First and foremost, probably to protect their own lives and identity. Many of these people were involved in higher society in England at the time. Their queen, Queen Elizabeth, was known as the Virgin Queen, very much attempting to protect her status as a virgin, which was very important politically vis-a-vis the Pope in Rome. And let's not forget that her father, King Henry VIII, was definitely anathematically seen in Rome because of his breakaway church in the Church of England. This was a highly charged time. The identities and actions of those that used the pen name of William Shakespeare were very important and must be protected. The individuals that were among those people that collectively were considered William Shakespeare were none other than the Queen's mathematician and astrologer, John Dee, as well as her lover, Edward de Vere, including as well Sir Francis Bacon, and beyond that, others inclusive of Christopher Marlowe. These people wrote together the works of the sonnets and the plays. But what and why have they encrypted? Well, Alan, through his 17 years of research, has been able to uncover these encryptions for us today. And a great mystery pointing to one irrevocable place, the Ross Tau or Giza Plateau.
Well, here are the two proportions that produce the E-1 ratio, followed by another sequence of proportions in purple. You don't have to do the math, just hold your breath, because the ratios of these proportions are to an incredible 2 5,000ths of a foot and 4 5,000ths of a meter. Staggering. So the three most prominent units of measure are found intimately connected to each other in the basic proportions pyramid. and in the same place where we found the 12 math constants. If we reduce the green, foot, to unity, the red measures 1.718 feet. This is actually the structure of Euler's number E, the ratio 1 to 1.718. And so the cubit is E minus 1. This is the relationship between foot and cubit. Jacob Bernoulli, in 1683, working on compound interest, discovered this formula, the same one that banks use today to calculate the interest we owe on our credit cards. 1 is the amount that we borrow. And if we're compounding at 100% interest continuously, the maximum possible owed on a loan of $1 converges to 1.718, and the total is E, 2.718, and that's the total owed to the bank. This rate of growth is inherently built into creation. It's the natural base of logarithms. The incredible thing is, this implies the foot is synonymous with the principle, the original unity, what we start with. And the cubit, the interest or growth, well, it doesn't only apply to banking. It shows up in calculus, probability theory. It's used to predict population growth or the rate of spread of an epidemic. Its inverse is the rate of radioactive decay. It's everywhere. Newton found the same thing in 1669 with this infinite series of what's called reciprocal factorials. They're on the bottom with the exclamation points. They simply mean 1, 2 times 1, 3 times 2 times 1, etc. to infinity. And this part of the series converges to 1.718, and there's the 1, unity, preceding it, exactly as in Bernoulli's formula. Haven't we always been told that the foot was based on the average size of a human foot and the cubit on the distance from the point of the index finger to the elbow? And doesn't such an arbitrary choice sound bizarrely unscientific, especially now that we see beyond doubt they're both based on this mathematically significant relationship, the universal constant of E. So what about the meter? By reducing it by the same ratio to match the unity foot, we discovered this meter is the equivalent of 3.281 feet. Now, is there any mathematical connection between it and the cubit? Well, the French derived it from 1/10,000,000th part of the meridian of the polar circumference. At least that's based on the science of geodesy, measuring the actual size of the Earth by the inherent geometry of circles. Perhaps we should look at other reliable, consistent attributes of our planet, like the 12 hours of day and the 12 hours of night that mark the Earth's rotation, or the 12-month seasons of its yearly revolution of the sun, which gives rise to the 12-month zodiac signs of the constellations, which themselves embody a retrograde pattern far more mysterious to track, but which the ancient Vedic scriptures declare is based on a series of seasons, if you will, that take our planet through an inconceivably long cycle in multiple increments of 1,200 years each for the Iron Age, 2 times 1,200 each for the Bronze, 3 times 1,200 each for the Silver Age, 4 times 1,200 each for the Golden Age, and which altogether constitutes Plato's great year. Cycle of 12,000 years ascending to 12,000 years descending. The question is, do we see a reflection of such patterns anywhere here in the meter-cubit relationship? Well, if we take a circle of radius 1 meter, its circumference is 12 cubits. So 1 cubit is exactly this portion of the arc, 1/6 of a slice of pi, or pi over 6, just the way we measure angles in radians. Pi over 6 is 0.5236. If we take the cubit in feet and divide by the meter in feet, it's precisely the same. Beautiful, yes? Let's take the whole thing now. Make foot, cubit, meter the radius of our circle. The circumference now is 12 pi feet. That's to an astounding 99.9993% accuracy. Or look at just cubic meter as the radius. Let's stretch this here. That's now 10 pi feet circumference. In fact, when we make the cubit be the perfect e minus 1 meter, the perfect pi over 6, which works out to this little formula here, and the foot is perfect unity, the inherent mathematical perfection is in there between foot and cubit e, between cubit and meter pi, and it produces this. Cubit meter is exactly 5 feet, all but for a minuscule 0.00004 feet. That's to an incredible accuracy of 2/50,000th of a foot. To put that into perspective, it's roughly the size of a human red blood cell. And of course, that means that all three combined is 6 feet. Now, the numbers 5 and 6 are found everywhere in sacred geometry. 5 representing the microcosm of the normal everyday life we experience on Earth. 6 representing the macrocosm, the state of being we associate with divine wisdom or our reconnection with God. And how does man attain this state? Simply by recognizing the presence of the One, the original unity, out of which the 5 of earthly existence has grown. So we see there's a stunning spiritual metaphor playing out here in this trinity of the world's predominant measuring systems. Foot, cubit, meter, simultaneously and cumulatively representing 3 different stages of growth.
One of the things that we learned very quickly as we analyzed the Great Pyramid is the Great Pyramid itself seems to house within its proportional dimensions new, hidden knowledge. Now, if you lived several thousands of years ago and you wanted to encrypt something for future generations, how could you encrypt it in a way that would be impervious to physical and outside calamity, earthquakes? How could you ensure that the papers and papyri that you wrote on wouldn't one day be burned and lost to history? Possibly the only way to do it would be to build a standing structure of mathematical proportions that were so obvious to the seeker that he or she could determine on their own the messages held within, in a message of standing and living stone. What we have found, and what Alan's research has revealed, is that the Great Pyramid actually houses and embeds within it all the mathematical constants. In fact, we have taken this analysis to include over 80 of the mathematical and physical constants that virtually determine the nature of our universe around us. And additionally, even the units of measure themselves that we use through the ages, namely the Royal Egyptian cubit, which is 1.718 feet, the meter, as well as the foot, all embedded into the construction of the Great Pyramid. But what does this tell us? The ancient builders of the Giza Plateau seem to very clearly have known the foot, the cubit, and the meter, and have embedded in the construction of the Great Pyramid advanced knowledge, possibly exceeding our own knowledge today of fundamental mathematical constants. What the Renaissance polymaths had uncovered and understood is that the Great Pyramid is simply a reflection of our own understanding and ascending awareness and greater consciousness. John Dee, the Queen's astrologer in Elizabethan England, was a genius mathematician and polymath. He was also an incredible cryptographer who had done amazing things. Some credit him even with assisting the Queen to defeat the Spanish Armada, more than 500 ships that came to attack and take control and conquer England at its moment of weakness. Somehow, after the Queen had met with John Dee, an incredible storm fell upon the Spanish Armada, which left it broken and destroyed, paving the way for England to become a powerhouse nation vis-a-vis the other countries across the European theater at the time. John Dee was also a Hermeticist. As a Hermeticist, he understood the relationship of Thoth, Hermes, Trismegistus. In fact, in a treatise that he wrote called the Monas Hieroglyphica, he articulated the details of what it meant to experience higher knowledge of Hermeticism. In that Hermetic treatise, he describes all the details of this higher dimensional form of understanding and wisdom. The Monas Hieroglyphica stands for us today as an ensign and an example of what each of us can attain to achieve a higher level of wisdom. In our next episodes, we're going to be showing you the relationship of how we can take this higher knowledge of Hermetic wisdom and apply it to our daily lives. We're also going to find deeper, more hidden encryptions in others of Leonardo da Vinci's works, and even examine other polymaths through time who have encrypted these self-same messages to us for our benefit and use today. I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex. The Salvator Mundi is a crowning achievement work considered by many to be one of the greatest works of Leonardo da Vinci. In fact, only a few years ago, it sold at auction and is now considered the most valuable painting in the world, having sold at a total price, including commissions and fees, of $450 million, a stunning value. It was unprecedented at any such auction for any such valuable work of art ever before. Despite all of that, there's still a lot of questions about the true authenticity of whether or not the Salvator Mundi is actually a work of art made solely by the hand of Leonardo da Vinci. Some believe that it was really more a work of art done by one of his students or followers. It is not clear until today who actually made the Salvator Mundi. I decided to look at it from a different perspective. The perspective I saw it from was actually that I now know that inside of the Vitruvian Man, the Last Supper, and La Belle Fronière are hidden encryptions, the likes of which are all pointing back to the same place, the Ras Tau pyramids in Giza, Egypt. Maybe if Leonardo was truly the architect and truly the artist behind the masterpiece we call the Salvator Mundi, we would find the same types of encryptions that we found in the other paintings, containing direct references not only to the pyramid slope angle, but also maybe even potentially to the notion of Alpha and Omega, which we saw in the Last Supper, hidden in the tapestry on the wall, also in Jesus. I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex.
Welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Robert J. Gilbert. In this episode, we will explore the hidden powers of the most famous forms in sacred geometry, the 5 Platonic solids, which are the forms for the 4 elements of nature and the mysterious 5th element. You'll then learn a little-known Rosicrucian practice, using these powerful forms to expand your consciousness and help you to open up perception of higher worlds. In our previous episodes, we showed the power of the sphere as the perfect sacred geometric container for new life and for all of creation. We saw the sacred geometry transformation of the sphere from a containing form to become a dynamic energy activation form, the torus. The Platonic solids are also derived from the primal sacred geometry form of the sphere, but they have undergone a different transformation than the torus. The divine pact thought form behind the Platonic solids is that they are the only 5 perfect ways to divide a sphere. Each way of dividing it creates a different form, which releases a different power. Every face on a particular solid has the same shape, either a triangle, square, or pentagon. The same number of faces meet at every corner or vertex of the form, and every line on every face is the exact same length. The original forms of the Platonic solids are spherical. Then each face is flattened to make the Platonic solids as they were taught to the Greeks and as they are popularly known today. Our oldest historical artifacts of the Platonic solids are from Scotland, where many ancient stone forms have been found which are well over 3,500 years old. Interestingly, in these oldest artifacts, the Platonic solids always appear in their primordial spherical form. The familiar flattened faces that we know today were popularized by the Greek school of Pythagoras, with information likely gathered from ancient Egypt and Babylonia. We know from the writings of Plato that the Greeks knew that the Platonic solids were connected to the hidden energy grids of the Earth. In our first episode, we showed the net of the Earth grids, the energy patterns of the Earth based on the Platonic solids. Each of the 5 ways of dividing the sphere creates a form connected to one of the 4 elements of nature: earth, water, air, and fire. The 5th form is connected to the mystery of the 5th element, which the Greeks called the ether. This is the dynamic energy of life itself. The tetrahedron is the form behind the power of fire. It has 4 triangular faces. The octahedron is the form behind the power of air. It has 8 triangular faces. The cube is the form behind the power of earth. It has 6 square faces. The icosahedron is the form behind the power of water. It has 20 triangular faces. The 5th and final form, the form kept hidden in the writings of Plato and the Pythagorean school in Greece, because of its tremendous potential power, is the 5th element, the ether, the dynamic life force itself, which is the source of the 4 earthly elements. This is the dodecahedron, with 12 pentagonal faces. Each of these Platonic solids is a deep world within itself, full of embedded knowledge and power. Each one is a packed thought form from the mind of God. The best known of these forms, the cube of earth with 6 square faces, we will explore in greater detail in a future episode, where we will see that it is the form for creating the physical plane itself. The cube is a sealed chamber, an alchemical retort we are placed in as young spiritual beings in order to go through deep spiritual transformation processes during our earthly life. Let's dive deeper now into the mysteries of the other 4 Platonic solids. The first and simplest of the Platonic solids is the tetrahedron of fire, with 4 triangular faces. The tetrahedron is the minimal, most fundamental 3-dimensional form which can be created with straight lines. One of the key thought forms from the mind of God behind the tetrahedron is that it holds the pattern of the original 1 point of the divine unity, which is being solidly supported by the 3 points of a trinity for manifestation purposes. In the Christian tradition, this packed thought form of the tetrahedron is the principle of the divine unity, the true Godhead, resting on the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In the structure of the human energy field, this trinity of support becomes the human divine spirit being supported by 3 anchor points for the human soul, also known in the Western esoteric tradition as the astral body. In an upcoming episode, we will explore these 3 anchor points of the soul, and they support the spirit in the human body, just as the 3 points of the triangle at the base of the tetrahedron support the 1 point
The more you begin to investigate,
this is the sun. As far back as 10,000 BC, history is abundant with carvings and writings reflecting people's respect and adoration for this object. And it is simple to understand why, as every morning the sun would rise, bringing vision, warmth, and security, saving man from the cold, blind, predator-filled darkness of night. Without it, the cultures understood the crops would not grow and life on the planet would not survive. These realities made the sun the most adored object of all time. Likewise, they were also very aware of the stars. The tracking of the stars allowed them to recognize and anticipate events which occurred over long periods of time, such as eclipses and full moons. They in turn cataloged celestial groups into what we know today as constellations. This is the cross of the zodiac, one of the oldest conceptual images in human history. It reflects the sun as it figuratively passes through the 12 major constellations over the course of a year. It also reflects the 12 months of the year, the 4 seasons, and the solstices and equinoxes. The term zodiac relates to the fact that constellations were anthropomorphized or personified as figures or animals. In other words, the early civilizations did not just follow the sun and stars, they personified them with elaborate myths involving their movements and relationships. The sun, with its life-giving and saving qualities, was personified as a representative of the unseen creator or God, God's Son, the light of the world, the savior of humankind. Likewise, the 12 constellations represented places of travel for God's Son, and were identified by names, usually representing elements of nature that happened during that period of time. For example, Aquarius, the water bearer, who brings the spring rains. This is Horus. He is the sun god of Egypt of around 3000 BC. He is the sun anthropomorphized, and his life is a series of allegorical myths involving the sun's movement in the sky. From the ancient hieroglyphics in Egypt, we know much about this solar messiah. For instance, Horus, being the sun or the light, had an enemy known as Set, and Set was the personification of the darkness or night. And, metaphorically speaking, every morning Horus would win the battle against Set, while in the evening Set would conquer Horus and send him into the underworld. It is important to note that dark versus light, or good versus evil, is one of the most ubiquitous mythological dualities ever known, and is still expressed on many levels to this day. Broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Mary. His birth was accompanied by a star in the east, and upon his birth he was adored by 3 kings. At the age of 12, he was a prodigal child teacher, and at the age of 30, he was baptized by a figure known as Anup, and thus began his ministry. Horus had 12 disciples he traveled about with, performing miracles such as healing the sick and walking on water. Horus was known by many gestural names such as the Truth, the Light, God's Anointed Son, the Good Shepherd, the Lamb of God, and many others. After being betrayed by Typhon, Horus was crucified, buried for 3 days, and thus resurrected. These attributes of Horus, whether original or not, seem to permeate many cultures of the world, for many other gods are found to have the same general mythological structure. Attis of Phrygia, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected. Krishna of India, born of the Virgin Devaki, with a star in the east signaling his coming. He performed miracles with his disciples, and upon his death was resurrected. Dionysius of Greece, born of a virgin on December 25th, was a traveling teacher who performed miracles such as turning water into wine. He was referred to as the King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, the Alpha and Omega, and many others. And, upon his death, he was resurrected. Mithra of Persia, born of a virgin on December 25th, he had 12 disciples and performed miracles, and upon his death was buried for 3 days and thus resurrected. He was also referred to as the Truth, the Light, and many others. Interestingly, the sacred day of worship of Mithra was Sunday. The fact of the matter is, there are numerous saviors from different periods from all over the world which subscribe to these general characteristics. The question remains, why these attributes? Why the virgin birth on December 25th? Why dead for 3 days in the inevitable resurrection? Why 12 disciples or followers? To find out, let's examine the most recent of the solar messiahs. Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary on December 25th in Bethlehem. His birth was announced by a star in the east, which 3 kings or magi followed to locate and adorn the new Savior. He was a child teacher at 12, and at the age of 30 he was baptized by John the Baptist, and thus began his ministry. Jesus had 12 disciples, which he traveled about with, performing miracles such as healing the sick, walking on water, raising the dead. He was also known as the King of Kings, the Son of God, the Light of the World, the Alpha and Omega, the Lamb of God, and many, many others. After being betrayed by his disciple Judas and sold for 30 pieces of silver, he was crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected and ascended into heaven. First of all, the birth sequence is completely astrological. The star in the east is Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which, on December 24th, aligns with the 3 brightest stars in Orion's belt. These 3 bright stars in Orion's belt are called today what they were called in ancient times, the 3 kings. And the 3 kings and the brightest star, Sirius, all point to the place of the sunrise on December 25th. This is why the 3 kings follow the star in the east, in order to locate the sunrise, the birth of the sun. The Virgin Mary is the constellation Virgo, also known as Virgo the Virgin. Virgo in Latin means virgin. Virgo is also referred to as the house of bread, and the representation of Virgo is a virgin holding a sheaf of wheat. This house of bread and its symbol of wheat represents August and September, the time of harvest. In turn, Bethlehem, in fact, literally translates to house of bread. Bethlehem is thus a reference to the constellation Virgo, a place in the sky, not on Earth. There is another very interesting phenomenon that occurs around December 25th, or the winter solstice. From the summer solstice to the winter solstice, the days become shorter and colder. And from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, the sun appears to move south and get smaller and more scarce. The shortening of the days and the expiration of the crops when approaching the winter solstice symbolize the process of death to the ancients. It was the death of the sun. And by December 22nd, the sun's demise was fully realized. For the sun, having moved south continually for 6 months, makes it to its lowest point in the sky. Here a curious thing occurs. The sun stops moving south, at least perceivably, for 3 days. And during this 3-day pause, the sun resides in the vicinity of the Southern Cross, or Crux, constellation. And after this time, on December 25th, the sun moves 1 degree, this time north, foreshadowing longer days, warmth, and spring. And thus it was said, the sun died on the cross, was dead for 3 days, only to be resurrected or born again. This is why Jesus and numerous other sun gods share the crucifixion, 3-day death, and resurrection concept. It is the sun's transition period before it shifts its direction back into the northern hemisphere, bringing spring and thus salvation. However, they did not celebrate the resurrection of the sun until the spring equinox, or Easter. This is because at the spring equinox, the sun officially overpowers the evil darkness, as daytime thereafter becomes longer in duration than the night, and the revitalizing conditions of spring emerge. Now, probably the most obvious of all the astrological symbolism around Jesus regards the 12 disciples. They are simply the 12 constellations of the zodiac. which Jesus, being the Son, travels about with. In fact, the number 12 is replete throughout the Bible. Coming back to the cross of the zodiac, the figurative life of the sun, this was not just an artistic expression or tool to track the sun's movement. It was also a pagan spiritual symbol, the shorthand of which looked like this. This is not a symbol of Christianity. It is a pagan adaptation of the cross of the zodiac. This is why Jesus in early occult art is always shown with his head on the cross, for Jesus is the Son of God, the light of the world, the risen Savior who will come again, as it does every morning, the glory of God who defends against the works of darkness as he is born again every morning and can be seen coming in the clouds up in heaven with his crown of thorns or sun rays. Now, of the many astronomical metaphors in the Bible, one of the most important has to do with the ages. Throughout the scriptures, there are numerous references to the age. In order to understand this, we need to be familiar with a phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. The ancient Egyptians, along with cultures long before them, recognized that approximately every 2150 years, the sunrise on the morning of the spring equinox would occur in a different sign of the zodiac. This has to do with a slow, angular wobble that the Earth maintains as it rotates on its axis. It is called a precession because the constellations go backwards rather than through the normal yearly cycle. The amount of time it takes for the precession to go through all 12 signs is roughly 25,765 years. This is also called the Great Year. And ancient societies were very aware of this, and they referred to each 2150-year period as an age. From 4300 BC to 2150 BC, it was the age of Taurus, the bull. From 2150 BC to 1 AD, it was the age of Aries, the ram. And from 1 AD to 2150 AD, it is the age of Pisces, the age we are still in to this day. And in and around 2150, we will enter the new age, the age of Aquarius. Now, the Bible reflects, broadly speaking, a symbolic movement through 3 ages while foreshadowing a 4th. In the Old Testament, when Moses comes down Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, he is very upset to see his people worshiping a golden bull calf. In fact, he shattered the stone tablets and instructed his people to kill each other in order to purify themselves. Most biblical scholars will attribute this anger to the fact that the Israelites were worshiping a false idol or something to that effect. The reality is, the golden bull is Taurus the bull, and Moses represents the new age of Aries the ram. This is why Jews even today still blow the ram's horn. Moses represents the new age of Aries, and upon the new age, everyone must shed the old age. Other deities mark these transitions as well, such as Mithra, a pre-Christian god who kills the bull in the same symbology. Now Jesus is the figure who ushers in the age following Aries, the age of Pisces, or the 2 fish. Fish symbolism is very abundant in the New Testament. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with bread and 2 fish. When he begins his ministry walking along Galilee, he befriends 2 fishermen who follow him. And I think we have all seen the Jesus fish on the back of people's cars. Little do they know what it actually means. It is a pagan astrological symbolism for the sun's kingdom during the age of Pisces. Also, Jesus' assumed birth date is essentially the start of this age. At Luke 22:10, when Jesus is asked by his disciples where the last Passover would be, Jesus replies, "Behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water, follow him into the house where he entereth in. This scripture is by far one of the most revealing of all the astrological references. The man bearing the pitcher of water is Aquarius, the water bearer, who is always pictured as a man pouring out a pitcher of water. He represents the age after Pisces, and when the sun, God's son, leaves the age of Pisces, Jesus, it will go into the house of Aquarius, as Aquarius follows Pisces in the procession of the equinoxes. All Jesus is saying is that after the age of Pisces will come the age of Aquarius. Now, we have all heard about the end times and the end of the world. The cartoonish depictions in the book of Revelation aside, the main source of this idea comes from Matthew 28:20, where Jesus says, "I will be with you even to the end of the world." However, in the King James Version, world is a mistranslation, among many mistranslations. The actual word being used is eon, which means age. I will be with you even to the end of the age, which is true, as Jesus' solar Piscean personification will end when the sun enters the age of Aquarius. The entire concept of end times and the end of the world is a misinterpreted astrological allegory. Let's tell that to the approximately 100 million people in America who believe the end of the world is coming. Furthermore, the character of Jesus being a literary and astrological hybrid is most explicitly a plagiarization of the Egyptian sun god Horus. For example, inscribed about 3,500 years ago on the walls at the Temple of Luxor in Egypt are images of the Annunciation, the miracle conception, the birth, and the adoration of Horus. The images begin with Thoth announcing to the Virgin Isis that she will conceive Horus, then Neph, the Holy Ghost, impregnating the Virgin, and then the virgin birth and the adoration. This is exactly the story of Jesus' miracle conception. In fact, the literary similarities between the Egyptian religion and the Christian religion.
See, check this out. If you would actually listen to when I be teaching the astrology and natal chart and all that, then you'll understand. See, that's the problem with people. I'm not just talking about you, I'm just speaking in general. So I'm trigger warning ahead of time. Nobody knows everything. That's the problem. Everybody think they know everything or more than anybody else. We all here to learn from each other. You'll never know everything. You'll still be learning to the day you leave here. That's why I told y'all about the birth chart. We are more than our sun sign. People presume think you will be, they judge your character by your sun sign. But you're not always appearing in your sun sign. The sun sign is your soul. And what is the soul? The soul is within, right? Your moon sign is your emotions. That's why it's called moon, because it's hidden. Your rising sign is how you really appear in the world. See what I'm saying? That's why it's called rising. See, I'm a Capricorn. I do show Capricorn traits, but I show Taurus traits and I show my rising, but I really show my rising sign, Leo, because I'm fiery. See what I'm saying? And I'm in my North Node, which is Scorpio. My purpose is to enlighten. See what I'm saying? Y'all better get some understanding.
Are staggering. And the plagiarism is continuous. The story of Noah and Noah's Ark is taken directly from tradition. The concept of the Great Flood is ubiquitous throughout the ancient world, with over 200 cited claims in different periods and times. However, one need look no further for a pre-Christian source than the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in 2600 BC. This story talks of a great flood commanded by God, an ark with saved animals upon it, and even the release and return of a dove, all held in common with the biblical story, among many other similarities. And then there is the plagiarized story of Moses. Upon Moses' birth, it is said that he was placed in a reed basket and set adrift in a river. in order to avoid infanticide. He was later rescued by a daughter of royalty and raised by her as a prince. This baby in a basket story was lifted directly from the myth of Sargon of Akkad of around 2250 BC. Sargon was born, placed in a reed basket in order to avoid infanticide, and set adrift in a river. He was in turn rescued and raised by Aki, a royal midwife. Furthermore, Moses is known as the lawgiver, the giver of the Ten Commandments, the Mosaic Law. However, the idea of a law being passed from God to a prophet up on a mountain is also a very old motif. Moses is just another lawgiver in a long line of lawgivers in mythological history. In India, Manu was the great lawgiver. In Crete, Minos ascended Mount Dicta, where Zeus gave him the sacred laws. While in Egypt, there was Meses, who carried stone tablets, and upon them the laws of God were written. Manu, Minos, Meses, Moses. And as far as the
Like
Ten
I say,
Commandments,
opinions
they
are like
taken
assholes.
outright from
Everybody
spell
got one,
125
Charles.
in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. What the Book of the Dead phrased, "I have not stolen,"
I
became,
believe how
"Thou
I
shalt
believe,
not
you believe
steal."
how you believe.
I have not killed became, "Thou shalt not kill." I have not told lies became, "Thou shalt not bear false
I don't force
witness,"
my beliefs on
and so
nobody.
forth. In fact, the Egyptian
I just
religion
put it
is
out there for
likely
people
the
who want to
primary
know it,
foundational basis
so they
for
can
the
get it.
Judeo-Christian
People who want the
theology.
same, who
Baptism,
have the same beliefs
afterlife,
as I do.
final judgment, virgin birth, death and resurrection, crucifixion, the Ark of the Covenant, circumcision,
I know, Charles, we
saviors,
good.
Holy
You know I
Communion,
love you.
Great Flood, Easter, Christmas, Passover, and many, many more are all attributes of Egyptian ideas long predating Christianity and Judaism. Justin Martyr, one of the first Christian historians and defenders, wrote, "When we say that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was produced without sexual union, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those who you esteem sons of Jupiter." In a different writing, Justin Martyr said, "He was born of a virgin, accept this in common with what you believe of Perseus." It's obvious that Justin and other early Christians knew how similar Christianity was to the pagan religions. However, Justin had a solution. As far as he was concerned, the devil did it. The devil had the foresight to come before Christ and create his characteristics in the pagan world.
Them motherfuckers hell like this.
Fundamentalist Christianity, fascinating. These people actually believe the world is 12,000 years old. Swear to God.
The world been here for millions of years.
Okay, dinosaur fossils. He says, dinosaur fossils? God put those here to test our faith. I think God put you here to test my faith.
Oh, you ready for some grooves now, huh? Hello, I'm gonna come back up with some grooves because every time I do some music, they want to give me a copyright claim, and I don't want a copyright claim on this video. But I'll be right back with some music. All right,
of one character's attributes to a new character
that's
can
cool.
be found within the book itself. In the Old Testament, there is the story of Joseph. Joseph was a prototype for Jesus. Joseph was born of a miracle birth. Jesus was born of a miracle birth. Joseph was
We're
of
gonna
12
get in our
brothers.
slow jams.
Jesus had 12 disciples.
The dirty side, the dirty,
Joseph
dirty.
was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was sold